I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. Predictions of a far-right takeover in the 2024 EU Parliament elections only partially panned out, as far-right groups in France, Germany, and Italy made major gains, but ultimately the center-right maintained a majority in the bloc. RANE's Europe analyst Matteo Ilardo is here to explain the likely implications of the Parliament elections on the new European Commission and the EU's priorities going forward. Hi Matteo, how are you?
I'm good, Emma. Thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. So to start off, generally, can you explain what the role of the EU Parliament is and why do we kind of care about EU Parliament elections?
So the European Parliament is effectively the legislative branch of the European Union. That means that it has a key role in the legislative process for many policy areas, not all, we'll see. In the European Union, but it also is very different from a national parliament, and in this way, it also has very different powers, very much less power than a national legislature, but still plays a key role in giving a political direction, a policy direction to the bloc. First of all, the role of the European Parliament is the role of a co-legislator. Differently from national parliaments, the legislature in the legislative role in the European Union is divided between the Parliament along with the Council of the European Union, which effectively is the member states, which usually vote either unanimously or by majority or qualified majority, depending on the policy, and the European Commission, which is effectively the executive of the European Union, and is the one that proposes policy, which eventually the European Parliament and member states will negotiate and decide upon. As such, the European Parliament has the power to adopt, modify or outright reject legislation by the European Commission, but it can't propose it itself, which gives it a somewhat limited role. It also has the power to approve the budget of the European Union, or again, just like legislation, amend it or reject it. It also has the power to oversee how this budget is spent, basically with the role of ensuring that EU funds are used efficiently in the bloc for their intended purposes. And it has a supervisory role. One perhaps of the most significant powers of the European Commission in effective legislation is that it elects the European Commission. So that's the first sort of supervisory role it has over the executive. It approves what member states decide the new European Commission will look like. The European Parliament can vote that proposal or not. It also plays this role of democratic oversight over EU institutions. It has, for instance, the power to scrutinize and even sue the European Commission. We saw how now the former European Parliament a few months ago had threatened to initiate a legal action against European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for her role in deciding to disbursing frozen EU funds for Hungary, despite concerns over violations of the rule of law in the country. And of course, it has the power to appoint and dismiss not just the head of the European Commission, but also the College of Commissioners, which plays sort of the role that ministers would play in a national government. It also has an important symbolic and political role because it's the only democratically elected institution within the European Union, which means that its composition reflects effectively the politics, the general political orientation of the bloc, and it's the democratic expression of voters across member states. So it has also this very symbolic importance, and we'll see how that plays a key role in European Parliament elections per se. It has, as said, also significant limitations in its power. For instance, it cannot initiate legislation. It can only amend or rediscuss, so to say, legislation together with member states, because the right to produce legislation is reserved to the European Commission. And of course, it has limited executive powers in this sense. It doesn't have the power to enforce any laws or implement any policy. These are all prerogatives of the European Commission or member states. And it has clear limited jurisdiction. It means that foreign policy and national security, that's all reserved to member states. Trade is usually reserved to the European Commission. So the European Parliament plays a significant role in other types of legislation. We saw how, for instance, the European Parliament was fundamental in passing environmental legislation because of a particularly more ambitious environmental force sitting in the Parliament compared to member states. So in some areas it does have a very significant effect in affecting policy, for instance, on the climate sphere. Then why EU elections matter besides what the European Parliament does? It's because European Parliament elections very often play this role of a midterm referendum towards incumbent governments. Basically, EU voters see these as an opportunity, a very, let's say, cost-effective opportunity to send a message to their governments. And usually, European Parliament elections are seen as a protest vote against whichever party is in power. And we see how that has historically significant effects on the stability of national governments, but in particular this time around, and I guess we'll talk about it later.
Can you give a brief overview of what happened during these recent elections? What major outcomes will have key implications going forward?
Yeah, as you rightly pointed out in your introduction, we expected far-right parties and right-wing parties in general to make significant gains across member states, and that happened. But at the same time, we also expected the center to hold within the European Parliament, and that plays out just as predicted. We saw center-right parties maintaining almost their majority within the European Parliament was untouched. I think only one seat of difference compared to the last election in 2019. We saw center-left parties, the socialists, losing a few seats, but nothing tragic. We saw the Liberals and the Greens, arguably the biggest losers out of these elections, losing significant amounts of seats in the European Parliament. But altogether, these parties, the so-called centrist, mainstream groups within the European Parliament, managed to maintain their overall majority. They together gather, if I'm not wrong, 400 seats, which is above the necessary threshold to form a ruling majority within the European Parliament and to elect a new European Commission. This means that the current grand coalition of these center-right, center-left and liberal parties will very much likely repeat their alliance in the upcoming new EU legislature. They will re-elect a very similar European Commission, most likely with Ursula von der Leyen again at the helm of the executive. And this means that we'll see a high degree of policy continuity in Brussels moving forward. It also, the outcome of the election also shows how right-wing parties made significant gains. Again, as we were saying, this was the case for the right-wing European Conservatives and Reformist ECR group, the group of, for among others, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and also the even more right-wing, especially significantly more Eurosceptic right-wing grouping within the European Parliament, the Identity and Democracy group. which the two groups came respectively fourth and fifth in the election, but increased their overall seat count. And this was particularly evident for the Identity and Democracy group, which includes, among others, the PVV party in the Netherlands of Geert Wilders, the Rassemblement National party in France of Marine Le Pen, and it used to include the far-right German party Alternative for Deutschland, which was excluded just right before the election for various scandals and various controversies surrounding the leadership of the party. But what we saw in general is an overall more conservative European Parliament, which will not significantly, if at all, change the overall direction of the European Union. It will very much maintain its centrist and pro-European integration, pro-moderate, generally moderate outlook, the institution, and will probably re-elect the von der Leyen as head of the European Commission. She will need 361 votes. It is not a given that all the elected lawmakers within the coalition, within the Grand Coalition, will vote for her. And that's because it's a peculiarity of the European Parliament to have a voting cohesion within the ruling majority that is not as straightforward as that of national parliaments, because parties tend to vote very often according there's a very loose alignment depending on the policy areas where they're asked to vote on. And the support in the European Commission can be one of these dividing political issues. So von der Leyen may, in the end up needing the support of some lawmakers from the ECR group, the right-wing, non-Eurosceptic right-wing group of Giorgia Meloni within the European Parliament. In that case, we may see with allegiances shifting within the European Parliament, we may also see policies shifting accordingly, and perhaps the ECR group and Giorgia Meloni's lawmakers playing a more constructive role in supporting policy proposals by the European Commission, which would influence these policy proposals, perhaps making them a bit more conservative, a bit less environmentally ambitious, but overall, again, I repeat, there will be a high degree of policy continuity, so more of the same in Brussels.
So given these results and your analysis of what's likely to come, what are the implications for individual EU member states?
Yeah, and that's the key point here. For EU member states, the consequences will be, they are more immediate, first of all. We already see them playing out in France, for instance, and there will be much more consequential, and the actual long-term implications of these events we'll find out in the coming weeks and months. As mentioned, in France, perhaps this is where the political fallout from the European Parliament elections was the most evident, the most shocking, and the one that is taking the most attention from observers. The French President Emmanuel Macron, after a very bad, very poor electoral result coming from EU elections, decided to call for a very surprising early parliamentary election in France, after he basically gathered less than half the votes that the far-right opposition party of Marine Le Pen, Rassemblement National, managed to gather at the election. So this was a humiliating defeat for the president, which sought to mobilize moderate voters against this danger of a rise in support for the far right. He absolutely failed to achieve this goal, and he decided to call for an early parliamentary elections, which will happen between the end of June and the very beginning of July. The vote will happen in 2 rounds, and now we see polls suggesting that Marine Le Pen's party will come on top, will emerge as the largest party within the French Parliament, the National Assembly. We don't know yet to what extent the party will be in the election, and that will be key to understand the future policy and political direction of France. The most likely outcome is a hung parliament where no party has a clear majority of seats. And this is already what we have had for the past 2 years in France, since Macron lost his outright majority in the National Assembly at the legislative elections in 2022. But it's going to be an even more complicated situation, because Macron won't be able, by all means, most likely won't be able to bridge the difference between his centrist alliance seats and the seats needed to pass legislation by counting on ad hoc alliances with the center-right Republican, which so far have helped Macron in passing some of its legislative proposals. Other times Macron just outright ignored parliament by, for instance, to pass his notorious pension reforms that did drive a lot of the political backlash that led to Marine Le Pen's victory. But in general, we'll see an even more complicated situation under a repeat of the hung parliament we have now. The second most likely scenario is that we have the Rassemblement National basically managing to gather enough seats to form a majority, elect a prime minister either on its own or with the help of other right-wing party. We saw how the backlash caused within the center-right Republican Party, which is effectively the traditional center-right in France, when the leader, Éric Ciotti, decided to ally with the Marine Le Pen's party, and basically that caused an implosion within the party, with a lot of moderate MPs and senior leaders resigning or asking Ciotti's resignation. So that's not a given, but at least a few parliamentarians from the party could help Marine Le Pen, if needed, to achieve an outright majority, and so may other smaller far-right parties such as Éric Zemmour's Reconquête party. So we may see a situation in which the far-right manages to form a government and elect a prime minister, in this case Jordan Bardella, the leader of the party that took over from Marine Le Pen, and then we'll still have Macron as the president, as a lame duck president that still remains in control, more or less, according to the French constitution, of defense, security and foreign policy in France. But then everything concerning domestic policy and legislation falls under the responsibility of the prime minister. So we basically have two leaders pushing in opposite directions, and the extent to which they'll manage to collaborate will determine the policy and political stability in France. But in general, what we're likely going to see is chaos as a result of this situation. We'll cover the election in France. We'll publish an election preview in the days leading to the election, so you'll be able to see more in details what this could mean for France. And then very briefly, we saw quite a significant political fallout in Germany as well. We saw the ruling parties, the Chancellor's SPD party, the Socialists, the Greens, and the pro-business liberal FDP party of Finance Minister Christian Lindner, all together gathering only 31% of preferences, which is roughly equivalent to what the main opposition party, the center-right CDU, managed to gather on its own. That's quite a clear message of disapproval towards the work of the ruling coalition, which has been very unpopular ever since it took office at the end of 2021. Now it's to its lowest level of approval. This is increasing the pressure on the German government to resign effectively. Opposition parties are calling for new elections, but new elections are also very complex to have in Germany, which is effectively a political system designed for early elections to never occur, or to be a very complex outcome, because it's a political system designed to ensure government stability. This means that the government is likely to remain in office, but being less and less popular, the three coalition parties will try to elevate their electoral profiles ahead of votes, for instance, at the state level, state elections in September. We'll have federal elections in 2025. So the three parties that they're falling in approval ratings will seek to change the course of their party from an electoral point of view, to harden their stance, and finding compromises to approve legislation will become even harder. The German government has been painfully slow and sometimes erratic in its decision-making process, both at the national and at the EU level, and this is only set to worsen over the coming months. And last but not least, but also completely different, we had a government, the one in Italy, that emerged stronger from European Parliament elections. The party of Giorgia Meloni, the right-wing Brothers of Italy party, managed to secure a substantial lead over any other party in Italy, over its two coalition partners. It received even more support than it did at the last legislative election, and basically confirmed that the party maintains a very healthy dose of support among Italian voters. This is strengthening the Prime Minister, but at the same time, it could weaken, moving forward, the coalition in Rome, and that's because we had a rebalancing of the balance of power within the coalition. Forza Italia, of late, Silvio Berlusconi, got slightly more votes than the right-wing anti-immigration party Lega of Matteo Salvini, and that could destabilize the coalition moving forward, because Salvini feels its party is losing consensus, it's losing approval, and it will need to go back to its old method of growing in popularity by embracing anti-establishment stances. But if you're a government party, that's a bit difficult. Obviously, that causes tensions with your coalition partners. So we'll see how that plays out. And also, this is going to be even more the case if Giorgia Meloni effectively manages, as I was saying earlier, to play a constructive role within the upcoming European Parliament, for instance, by supporting actively von der Leyen in the new European Commission. This would make it even more evident how the difference within the ruling coalition in Rome between Giorgia Meloni's party and Matteo Salvini's Eurosceptic Lega party. So we may see this destabilizing moving forward and potentially lead to political instability in Italy, which wouldn't be unheard of in the country.
Thanks for these insights, Matteo. It's always great to hear from you, and I'm sure we'll be following up with you on this shortly.
Thank you for having me, Emma.
Matteo Ilardo is a Europe analyst at RANE. You can find more of his analyses or learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thanks for listening.